were away. So thank you very much for joining us today. This is Jess Phillips, MP for Birmingham and Yardley. And we're going to talk about those young people that have moved from children's services into adult services that experience exploitation. So thank you for joining us, Jess.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's a great pleasure. As we know, child exploitation has hit the headlines for a number of years with high-profile court cases and our own CSE Awareness Day, which of course is today, with thousands and thousands of people who follow that and do events and host things. And the focus has always been to raise the awareness and what have you. But today, we recognise that the focus on children, young people who are exploited diminishes when they reach 18, and they are one day seen as somebody that are in need of protection, and the following day they're making a life choice. How well do you think exploitation is understood? Do perceptions and understanding differ to the age of the victim, especially those entering adulthood?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely my experience from all the cases that I've handled and all the conversations actually that I have had with policymakers in government, is there is just this cliff edge, and we sort of know about it in the world of children in care, where we have recognised that actually their vulnerabilities, I mean, obviously their vulnerabilities also don't just end at this stage, but we allow as a state for up to 25 to be considered within the care system of children going into adulthood needing that transition, but we just do not do that in sexual exploitation services. And so if you look at the data on women who are prostituted, the vast majority of those women start that exploitation journey in childhood, and that is not recognised at all. Just on the very bare bones of it, we do have strategies and language even around child sexual exploitation, thanks to, you know, the last 2 decades really of effort by professionals to properly understand the idea of what we used to once upon a time called child prostitution.
Yes.
No professional would ever say that again. And we have strategies, cross-departmental strategies, whether in the Home Office, the Department for Education. We have an understanding of what child sexual exploitation is. We just don't have any of those same documents or strategies or effort that is put into adult sexual exploitation. And the cliff edge, you will literally go one day from being something that the government has funding, strategies, and attention on, to the very next day, the day after your 18th birthday, being completely and utterly without any resource. So there is no government allocation of funds for adult sexual exploitation. There is no government strategy. There is no understanding. And recently in the Criminal Justice Bill Committee, we tried to lay some amendments that would call for the definition of adult sexual exploitation to go into law as basically almost completely lifted from the definition in law of child sexual exploitation. And I'm afraid to say that ministers stood in front of me and said things like, well, adults have more of a voice. And we tried to get grooming to be considered in cases of domestic and sexual abuse and violence and sexual exploitation in adulthood, because grooming is a sort of standalone element within the sentencing structures in child sexual exploitation. And they just said no to doing that for adults, as if adults cannot be groomed. Or that their grooming didn't even start in childhood. Now, the vast majority of cases I've seen of childhood sexual exploitation is usually when it is manifesting as somebody having the sort of ability to come forward is in their adulthood. And so their experiences of child abuse and child exploitation is totally ignored because they're now an adult, even though it happened to them in childhood. And that is, yeah, I'd say that level of understanding currently and the level of priority is woeful.
And I mean, you've touched on it. We are hearing of so many of reductions in services, the funding crisis. We're hearing of dedicated exploitation units being disbanded in local authority, and this area of work, child exploitation, being absorbed into general child protection. We're losing all of those nuances of understanding around the whole coercion and control, and with funding for so many public services under threat, how do we ensure women and young women and young men, because I don't want to leave young men out of this,
100%.
Experiencing sexual exploitation, remain protected, particularly at that age of transition?
I mean, actually, it is one of the areas of interpersonal violence that I deal with, while still, obviously, the vast majority of the victim cohort are women. There is huge problem of adult sexual exploitation, specifically of young men, usually, who are suffering from problematic substance misuse. I've seen lots and lots of cases of adult sexual exploitation of young heroin addicts, crack and cocaine addicts, being used for sex in order to fund their habits. And that is undoubtedly a part of this that is even more untold, actually. But what you're talking about as funding cuts, what people don't understand, and I'm not even entirely sure that the government understand this, is that the idea that council cuts get put into all one big category, and you think of it as being your libraries and your parks and your bins, and actually those, as a politician, what I know is those are the things that local councils will seek to protect, because those are the things that people vote about. Now, what we saw about a decade ago, even in a time of, the beginnings of the council cuts, is we saw that this sort of explosion of understanding and series of high profile cases in child sexual exploitation did lead in local council areas, both those that we know were affected, but also lots that never hit the headlines, because this happens everywhere, contrary to the sort of famous towns where this has happened, towns and cities. We did see the setup of really targeted child sexual exploitation support services. Even in a time of austerity, there was usually a part of children's services alongside the local police and crime boards, or commissioners as they became, funding specific professionals, social workers and specialists in rape and sexual violence to really, really focus on that. And I worked to develop one of those in the local area where I was working. And actually that should have always been seen as a real positive. It's quite hidden work. It's not the stuff that necessarily reaches the headlines, but the sort of multi-agency work that was going on was really, really, it was good to see council specialising in it. And actually, in lots of those cases, those institutions, those organisations that where that was set up, they would work alongside the adult human trafficking services locally, which was a service I also ran. And so actually the transition, because of those teams, from childhood to adulthood was not ignored. No. These were systems, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but in the cuts, it's so easy to, in a sort of post Rotherham Rochdale era, when it is not top of the political agenda, and I have to say usually for nefarious political reasons, it's so easy just to say, oh, well, all social workers should do this. This should be mainstreamed into all children's social work. And what happens in those, because it's an easy cut to make. So we'll just make all those people generic children's social workers rather than having specialism. And what happens in all my experience of over the years of cuts is when you make something everybody's business, it becomes nobody's business. And so
well,
you
lose the expertise, don't you?
Well, exactly. You lose the level of trust, you lose the level of responsiveness to their victims, in that they get to know the people. And actually, what you'll find is children who have been supported, and let's face it, even children supported by this setup that we're talking about, the very few of them will have gone on to get conviction. But what they may have gone on to get, what the actual outcome that people who work in that environment were always focusing on, was that those children were thriving, that they were able to thrive. And I've sat in front of 16, 17-year-olds right up to 30-year-olds, knowing that the lack of trust in the system and the slowness of the system means the outcome we're going for isn't necessarily justice as the nation would see it. Justice to me is these people free from harm and being able to get on with their lives and thrive one day with their own children, and good careers. And I think that people don't understand that those teams, those specialist teams, they did that transition without really ever being asked to, and kept an overarching look on children as they transition to a sort of thriving adulthood, which is their sort of outcome and aim. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that every children's social worker should be trained on child sexual exploitation.
Oh, absolutely.
And
every police officer, every social worker.
I absolutely think everybody should have training, but you make it into a mainstream thing where training is enough, and you don't have the specialist teams involved. It just becomes, it goes lower and lower down the priority. The resources get squeezed. It's just, I mean, I am terrified actually that all the work, and the government should really, really, really want to tell a story about how most of those teams, those specialist teams, were set up under this Conservative government, even in a time of austerity. They should really want to tell a story about that. But at the moment, I don't see anyone trying to protect them from the centre of government. Now, what I would do if I was the minister in charge of this, I would say, look, I recognise that there are cuts to councils. So from the centre, we have to incentivise this specialism. So we used to, years ago, in fact, this was under the last Labour government, you'd have like a match fund where the Home Office would give a certain amount of money, and then the local authority could only get that money if they matched it. And so there is then the incentive not to just mainline everything and to keep those specialisms. But I don't see any particular effort in making sure those teams are kept. I don't see any effort by the government. I think they don't even know that they exist is the problem.
And I think we've witnessed and seen so much amazing work done by teams, nuggets of really, really good practice. The whole of the network is about sharing those practice, learning from one another and that wheel. And I think we could lose some of that. But
I think there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, one of the women I used to work with is when most sexual exploitation services were initially being set up, usually in the voluntary sector.
Yes.
Who then, lots of those women then went to work within these council-related teams. And I mean, the 3 women I worked with who then went to various different local authorities in the Midlands to help set up these specific targeted teams. All of them are now leaving. So, the writing's on the wall. And that's in 3 different local authority areas in the West Midlands, where I am definitely seeing this totally degrading. And the single thing that a victim, both adult and child, will say to you is that they cannot come forward unless they have a responsive service that understands and will keep them safe at the point of disclosure. And I think that people totally misunderstand how unsafe. Like, I think because people watch a lot of telly, anyone who watches a courtroom drama, don't think that you know what happens in court. It's considerably slower and more boring. However, what I see is this idea that if let's say 3 young girls and women aged between 13 and 20 came forward and said that they had been groomed by a specific ring of sexual exploiters, and that it had been even that level of organized, that's the one we're meant to care about. Let's ignore the fact that the vast majority of people are sexually exploited by their peers and people that they know. But even in those cases that we know have had so much political capital put into them, the idea that on the moment of disclosure that those young people will be housed somewhere safely immediately, in order to escape the fear of their perpetrators, who, when finding out that they have come forward, will threaten to kill them and their families, and sometimes absolutely succeed in that. The idea that what actually happens in reality is those people come forward, and a year and a half later, with no specialist housing, no anything put in, one person out of a ring of people might get charged and probably won't be remanded. And I think that people don't understand that. I think that they think that this is something that sweeps in and you get like witness protection, and none of that is true. And without those specialist teams holding those individuals in a very slow system, you are just going to lose those women.
Yeah. Yes.
And when I say lose them, I don't just mean from coming forward. You've lost their life, their capacity for life for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Their potential, all of their potential.
Their potential draining down the drain. Yeah. Unless you have, and you can see it when you work with someone for a very long time. And I am now a year out from sort of the closing, although I'll never close it, the closing of a case of a young woman who started being abused and exploited when she was 13, right up till she was 23. Nobody will ever be convicted for the crimes against her, which we sort of both know throughout. But she is now absolutely thriving, living completely safely, has a really good job, has a first-class degree. But that was only because I kept her in various different systems, and it relied on being a trained specialist who gave enough time. Case management, the caseloads that a generic social worker already has in this space would never allow for even just an hour a week just chatting.
Yes, yeah, the value of the third sector is immense, really, isn't it? But Jess, thank you so much for today. It's very, very kind of you to lend your time to us, and thank you very much.
Onwards we fight.
Stop recording, that's brilliant.